Hi everyone, this video is going to be focusing in on natural selection and how it works. In the previous video, we introduced evolution and natural selection. So hopefully you remember that evolution is the pattern that we see in nature, and specifically the pattern that over time populations will change. And specifically, they're changing with regard to a heritable trait. So, natural selection is the explanation of how this happens. It's the process or the mechanism that drives evolution. But there are certain conditions that have to be present in order for natural selection to occur. Natural selection isn't just something that's always going to happen. There needs to be certain conditions that are in place. So, what are these conditions? So, the first one is variation in traits. And this is just the idea that in a population, the individuals that make up that population need to have, they can't be identical, they need to have variation. And so this variation could be something like color or other physical things like size. It could also be behavioral, it could be something physiological, but we need differences among the individuals in our population. The second condition is that there needs to be differential reproduction based on these traits. And this idea of differential reproduction is just getting at um, in nature, it's not the case that every individual organism is going to be able to survive and reproduce to the maximum potential possible. Some individuals are going to have more offspring than others. And specifically, it's going to be individuals with traits that are better suited to the environment, that are going to survive and that are going to reproduce and pass on their genes. So, in our example, not every beetle is going to be having all the possible babies that they could. And in particular, it looks like birds, the predator, seem to prefer the green beetles over the tan beetles. So in this case, the tan beetles are better suited to the environment. Maybe they blend into the tree bark more or something like that. And so the tan beetles are going to have more offspring than the green beetles. So there's a differential in reproduction based on this variation that we saw. And then finally, these traits need to be heritable. So we talked about we have variation in traits. Certain traits, such as being tan, need to be helping organisms to survive and reproduce more than others. And these traits need to be heritable. So the brown color that's helping the beetles survive and reproduce needs to be able to be passed on to the offspring. And those are the three conditions that need to be in place, or the three ingredients, if you want to think about it that way, for natural selection to occur. If these ingredients are in place, or if these conditions are happening, then the result is that we will get evolution. We will get a population that's changing over time because the adaptive traits, such as being tan, are going to become more common because organisms that have those beneficial traits are going to survive, they're going to reproduce more, and they're going to pass on those traits to their offspring. And since the traits are heritable, those offspring will have them as well, and that's how they'll become more common. So we'll go over one sort of classic example of natural selection in action, and then our last slide will just be a couple things to be careful of when you're thinking about natural selection. So our example is the peppered moth. And in this moth, it's the same species, but it comes in two different varieties. So we've got a dark version, which is right here, and it's very hard to see, but you can also see that there's a light version. It's easier to see the light version here. It's sort of speckled or mottled, and there's another dark one here. So they come in two forms, peppered and dark, and this coloration is heritable. So dark moths will give birth to dark moth offspring, and peppered moths will give birth to peppered moth offspring. Um, these moths are eaten by predators like birds, so not all of them are going to successfully reproduce. So it seems like all of our conditions for natural selection are met, and here's how this played out. Originally, uh, the dark form was quite rare, and that's because the trees were looking like this picture on the left. It's the natural color of the bark and the lichen sort of on it, and you can see that the dark moth sticks out quite a lot. So if birds were coming by, they would probably see the dark moth, whereas the peppered moth blended in a lot better and was probably able to avoid being eaten by as many birds, and therefore had more offspring, and therefore we had a higher percentage of peppered moths in the population. But During England's Industrial Revolution, there was a lot more pollution and soot and ash in the air. And the trees became covered in this soot and turned to look something more like this instead. So instead of that lighter bark with the lichen, we've got much darker bark. And you can see that against this background, the darker colored moth actually blends in much better. And it's the peppered moth that sticks out. And so birds started to eat the lighter peppered moths more. And so the proportion of dark colored moths rose. And we get change in the peppered moth population over time, going from where we have more peppered moths to now we have more dark moths because the environment had changed and the peppered moth population evolved along with it. Interestingly, eventually there was a clean air, anti-pollution laws that were put into place. And so the trees went back to looking more like this. And so now we've sort of swung back the other way where the lighter peppered moths are more common again. So that was a classical example of natural selection. And this last slide is just a couple important points when we're thinking about um, both natural selection and evolution. The first one is that populations can evolve. Individuals cannot. And that's because our definition of evolution was that in a population, there's a genetic or a heritable change in traits over time. And our genes aren't substantially changing over our lifetime. We kind of are stuck with what we've got. So populations can evolve because the frequency of different traits caused by different genetics can change over time, but in an individual, those genes aren't changing. The second is that natural selection only acts on existing heritable variation. So natural selection works because some individuals in a population are more well adapted to that environment and they pass on the traits that they have that helped. But they need to have traits to pass on. It's not like natural selection can give organisms what they need. So it doesn't work on acquired traits because those traits need to have a genetic basis and it can't create new traits. So it only can work with what already exists in the population. It also doesn't give organisms what they need. Just because it might be helpful to have a certain trait, unless that trait already exists, natural selection can't make it more common. And the third is that natural selection doesn't create perfectly adapted organisms. So, this idea of compromise is going to come in when you think about the fact that organisms are doing often more than one thing with a given trait. So, we could think about a peacock's elaborate display, and we know that this helps male peacocks attract a mate. So, in that sense, a really, really big and colorful and beautiful situation here would help the peacock find a mate and pass on its genes. But the bigger and more elaborate this tail feather situation is, it makes the peacock harder to camouflage, so it's more obvious to predators. And it's also harder to get around. So we can't just have a infinitely large and colorful train here. It's got to be sort of striking a balance between something that will still allow it to attract a mate, but also allow it to move around enough that it is still mobile. And sort of a similar thing with giraffes. Giraffes' long necks help them reach food high up in the trees. But because of this long neck, it's also kind of hard for a giraffe to drink water. So we have to strike a balance between a neck that's long enough to allow the giraffe to eat leaves from the tree, but also not too long that the giraffe can't drink water. Okay, so that's our last slide, and this concludes our video on natural selection.